How did a tribe of nomadic pirates build a thriving metropolis in the middle of a waterless desert, carved directly into towering sandstone cliffs? Discover the rise and fall of the Nabataeans and the engineering secrets behind the legendary city of Petra. Back in 1812, a unique Swiss adventurer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt was making his way through the area we now call Jordan. Burckhardt was quite a character. Originally from the Lake Geneva area, he had gone to England for his education. There, he picked up a job with the African Association, a club of wealthy Englishmen who paid for exploration trips. Welcome to Mythic Index, a sanctuary for lost legends and forgotten timelines. Here, we peel back the layers of history to reveal the myths that shaped our world, from the fragments of the forgotten past to the vastness of the night sky. If you wish to ensure you can always find your way back to this archive, please subscribe now. Their assignment for him was to travel from Cairo across the Sahara Desert to make contact with Timbuktu, which was thought of as a lost city back then. Burckhardt didn't take this lightly. He dove into the role with the intensity of a true Georgian-era oddball. He started learning Arabic at Cambridge University. He even started walking around in traditional Arab outfits, sporting a turban and long white distashes, which definitely puzzled his classmates. Once he finished school, he relocated to Syria for 2 years to perfect his Arabic. He went so far as to use the alias Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdallah and tried to live as a Muslim. It remains a mystery whether his disguise actually worked or if the locals just played along. To get ready for the big trip, he launched several excursions into the Syrian desert, though many turned into catastrophes. He got robbed multiple times, sometimes even by the very guards he hired for protection. However, these failures didn't kill his thirst for adventure. By 1812, he started his trek from Syria down to Cairo, planning to catch a ride across the vast Sahara Sand Sea from there. During this trip, while braving the scorching summer heat on the perilous inland path, Burckhardt stumbled upon a completely unexpected find. His guides mentioned some secret ruins tucked away in a tight valley nearby, a place the locals called Wadi Mousa, or the Valley of Moses. Still maintaining his Arab disguise, Burckhardt had to invent a reason to see the site. He recorded the events in his diary on August 22, 1812. He wrote that he was very eager to see Moses Valley because the locals spoke of its antiquities with such awe. He hired a guide at Elgi to lead him there, paying for the service with a pair of used horseshoes. The guide carried a goat along with them and handed Burckhardt a water skin, knowing the valley floor was dry. As they descended into the arid canyon, Burckhardt grew more and more anxious that his cover would be blown and his trickery exposed. He noted that as they followed the Elgi stream westward, the valley tightened, marking the start of the Wadi Mousa antiquities. He apologized in his writing for not providing a full report, explaining that he knew the local temperament well. He was unprotected in a desert where no traveler had been seen before. Investigating these works of the infidels too closely would have made them suspect he was a magician hunting for treasure. He predicted that future visitors, backed by armed guards, would discover that these ruins rank among the most fascinating remnants of ancient art. From afar, it looked like Burckhardt was approaching a solid wall of bright red sandstone. However, as he got nearer, he spotted a hidden ravine splitting the rock face, with a small trickle of water running out. He observed that high rocks seemed to block the valley completely, but up close, he found a chasm about 15 to 20 feet wide. Through this gap, the stream flows west during the winter. The cliffs towering over the stream rise about 80 feet. In several spots, the opening at the top is actually narrower than at the ground level, blocking out the sky entirely. While moving through this shadowed canyon, his anticipation turned into pure awe when he saw a massive tomb carved directly into the surrounding red sandstone. He described continuing along the winding path until an excavated mausoleum appeared. He noted that its location and beauty were sure to make a striking impact on any traveler, especially after walking for 30 minutes through such a dark, subterranean-like passage. The locals referred to this monument as Qasr Pharaon, or Pharaoh's Castle, claiming a prince lived there. However, Burckhardt concluded it was actually a prince's tomb. He mused on the immense wealth of a city that could dedicate such grand monuments to its leaders. The discovery clearly overwhelmed him, as he wrote enthusiastically about the massive structure. He called it one of the most elegant ancient remains in all of Syria. It looked as pristine as a newly finished building, yet he realized it required incredible labor. The colonnade stands about 35 feet tall, featuring columns 3 feet thick with Corinthian capitals. A pediment sits atop the colonnade, featuring an isolated cylinder topped with a vase, flanked by 2 small temple-like structures on short pillars. From the column bases to the highest ornaments, the entire facade measures roughly 60 to 65 feet high. Johann Burckhardt had become the first modern European to enter a city that had been nothing more than a myth for the last 1,000 years. He had found the ancient city of Petra. For centuries, this place served as the core of a dominant kingdom that managed the incense and spice trade routes crossing the desert from the east. Its inhabitants constructed massive monuments, carving them with perfect skill right into the desert's sandstone bedrock. They managed to tame one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. These people, known as the Nabataeans, traded and waged war with great empires, taking a leading role in the historical dramas of their time. As Burckhardt explored the canyons and gullies of this lost metropolis, he must have questioned how a society could thrive in such a brutal Arabian landscape. If such a magnificent civilization developed here, what caused its streets and temples to empty, leaving them to be swallowed by the shifting desert sands? The questions arise: what traits did they share? What caused their collapse? And what was it like for those who watched their world end? We are about to explore one of the most incredible tales of civilizational survival ever recorded. Before we drift deep into the ancient past, take a second to tap the like button. Think of it as lighting a candle in this digital hall, helping other weary travelers find their way to these stories. To understand the full saga of the Nabataean trading empire, how modest merchants rose to become masters of the desert capable of defying great powers, we must first look at the ground beneath their feet. We will see how Petra blossomed into a global crossroads and uncover the events that ultimately toppled their civilization. But the story begins with geology. Sandstone. Sandstone is a type of sedimentary rock. It is created when layers of sand pile up and are subjected to immense pressure over time. This compression, combined with natural mineral reactions, fuses the individual grains into solid stone. In the region of Jordan where this historical drama takes place, 2 massive beds of this rock stretch out underground. These are identified as the Dissi and the Ishrin sandstones. The Dissi formation is the younger layer sitting on top. While the specific ingredients of the grains determine the color of any sandstone, this variety is hard and pale gray, typically weathering into recognizable dome-like shapes. However, lying underneath is the Ishrin layer, which is older by at least 20 million years. This rock is easily distinguished by the stunning patterns it displays. Thanks to a composition rich in manganese oxides, hydroxides, and iron, it is celebrated for its vibrant hues, weaving together deep rosy reds, purples, and rich oranges. The twisting, interlocking designs on these rocks were actually shaped by riverbeds that crossed this landscape roughly 500 million years ago, during the Mid-Cambrian era. Back then, Earth would have appeared like an alien world. The barren, rocky land held no animals, trees, or leaves, hosting only simple vegetation like lichens and mosses. With almost no polar ice, sea levels were incredibly high, flooding continents with warm, shallow oceans teeming with the era's largest life forms, such as trilobites and other crustaceans. Over the hundreds of millions of years that ensued, massive amounts of sand settled onto the ocean floors as waves pulverized the planet's crust and rainwater streamed down through rivers, carrying loads of silt and dust along with them. Nowadays, the specific band of rock known as the Ishrin sandstone layer measures over half a kilometer deep, though in most areas, sheets of newer gray limestone cover it up completely. That beautiful pink stone would have stayed hidden forever if not for the Arabian Peninsula's distinct tectonic activity. Currently, the massive African and Eurasian plates are crushing the Arabian plate from all sides. This pressure drives the plate northward at a speed of 15 millimeters annually, which is roughly the same pace that your fingernails grow. As this happens, the colossal energy generates mountain ranges across Iran, Syria, and Turkey, while the vice-like grip tilts the entire landmass. Consequently, every rock layer inside Jordan now leans slightly toward the northeast. That upper limestone coating was left vulnerable to the intense power of sand and wind. At specific spots like Petra, the Dead Sea's eastern coast, Dana, and Wadi Rum, the gray sandstone layers wore away. This erosion finally revealed the deep, vibrant red splendor of the long-buried Ishrin sandstone. The tale of the Nabataeans kicks off right here in this terrain of rosy rock. We find the very first clues about a group that might have been the Nabataeans within the records of the late kings of Assyria. This refers to the 8th and 7th centuries BC. Just like the many regional powers that came before them, the Assyrians found it incredibly difficult to maintain authority over the nomadic tribes wandering the southern deserts. We have a record from the 7th century BC Assyrian king Sennacherib, who left an inscription describing one of his military campaigns in the south. He boasted that during his first campaign, he successfully defeated Merodach-Baladan, the king of Babylonia, along with the army of Elam, his ally on the plains of Kish. He goes on to say that on his return march, he conquered several groups who refused to submit, including the Tumuna, the Ubudu, the Damunu, and the Nabatu. We also have writings from Sennacherib's grandson, King Ashurbanipal, regarding his encounters with these desert dwellers. He described the Nabatu as living in a distant wilderness so desolate that there were no wild beasts, and not even birds would build their nests there. Now, plenty of modern researchers argue that the similarity between the ancient name, Nabatu, and the later Nabataeans is just a coincidence. However, one fact remains certain. People have been living a nomadic lifestyle in the Arabian deserts since the very beginning of the region's history. These groups didn't build permanent cities, towns, temples, or even houses. Instead, they were as restless as the shifting sands, setting up tents wherever they traveled while moving alongside their herds. Their survival depended on raising livestock such as cows, sheep, and goats, which supplied them with essential wool, milk, and meat. They likely supplemented this by hunting and foraging whatever the environment offered, and they may have even planted orchards that they could revisit annually during their seasonal migrations. It appears that in their earlier days, the Nabataeans also engaged in banditry and piracy. They utilized their intimate understanding of the desert terrain to outwit and ambush the sluggish trade caravans traversing their lands and coastlines. We even have accounts from the 1st century Roman writer Strabo, who recounts that they dabbled in piracy on the high seas. He describes Nabataea as a populous land rich in pastures, noting that they also inhabited nearby offshore islands. Strabo explains that while they originally lived peacefully, they eventually used rafts to raid ships sailing from Egypt. However, this maritime plundering didn't last long, as a fleet was sent to sack their land as punishment. Before long, the Nabataeans seemingly realized there was more money to be made in protecting caravans than in robbing them. They began charging a fee for safe passage through their territory, and from that point, it was a natural progression to start organizing the caravans themselves. As the first millennium BC came to a close, the Nabataeans had successfully ousted their competitors, securing total dominance over the transportation of goods across the Arabian sands. Even as the initial books of the Hebrew Bible were being recorded, it is evident that the southern Arab kingdoms were already generating massive wealth. Specifically, 1 Kings 10:15 details the riches of the 10th century ruler King Solomon, while explicitly highlighting the prosperity of the Arab kingdoms. The text states that in a single year, the weight of gold that came to Solomon was 666 talents. This was in addition to the revenue collected from merchantmen, the spice trade, the governors of the land, and all the kings of Arabia. However, our first genuinely concrete account of the Nabataeans arrives second-hand from about 312 BC, courtesy of the Greek writer Hieronymus of Cardia. Hieronymus reportedly penned a comprehensive description of the people, diving deep into their lifestyle, culture, and history. Sadly, that specific text has been lost to time, but it served as a primary source for later scholars, including the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, who wrote more than 3 centuries later. Drawing on those earlier observations by Hieronymus, Diodorus provides an extensive account of the Nabataeans in his own work. He depicts them as a fiercely independent nomadic group who completely rejected the amenities of settled life to maintain their freedom. He introduces their ways by stating that, for the benefit of those who do not know, it will be useful to describe in detail the customs of these Arabs. By adhering to these traditions, they believe they can keep their freedom intact. They roam across a landscape that is partially desert and partially devoid of water altogether, though a tiny fraction of the land is fertile. They live entirely outdoors, claiming a wilderness as their home that lacks rivers or abundant springs, effectively preventing any hostile army from finding water. Their strict code forbids them from planting grain, growing fruit trees, drinking wine, or building permanent houses. If anyone is caught breaking these rules, the penalty is death. They follow this way of life because they believe that owning such assets makes a people vulnerable, as they can be easily coerced by powerful forces into submission to save their property. Diodorus also details the immense wealth the Nabataeans accumulated by controlling the critical trade routes for incense and spices. While some members of the tribe raised sheep or camels, pasturing them in the desert, the Nabataeans were far wealthier than other Arab tribes who used the desert for grazing. Even though their population was likely little more than 10,000, they stood out because many of them were in the business of transporting frankincense, myrrh, and high-value spices to the coast, goods they acquired from the primary suppliers. Let's look closer at frankincense and myrrh. These substances are actually resins produced by 2 different plants in the Piracy family, stunted, gnarled trees found in India, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. These trees have evolved a defense mechanism. When their bark is damaged, they release resin from the wound to create a glassy seal, protecting the delicate internal structure from further harm. However, trees are also prone to bacterial infections just like humans are, so as an added layer of defense, these resins are packed with volatile compounds designed to kill fungi and bacteria, acting much like our own immune system. It turns out that these same volatile chemicals interact with the human sense of smell in fascinating ways. For at least 5,000 years, people have utilized these resins for their antibacterial medical properties and for the striking aromas they release when burned. Frankincense produces a sweet, woody scent with hints of lemon, while myrrh offers a fragrance that is spicier and bitterer, with floral undertones. During harvest season, farmers slash the bark of the trees and gather the milky resin that oozes out. Once it is exposed to the sun and air, myrrh hardens into reddish-brown chunks about the size of peas, whereas frankincense dries into pale yellow, tear-shaped droplets. Diodorus of Sicily even claimed that the scent was so potent that sailors passing the coast of Arabia could smell it from their ships. There is a recorded account of a group of Greek sailors who ran out of supplies on the Arabian coast around the year 300. In their search for water, they stumbled upon a plantation of these trees. These sailors were later interviewed by the botanist Theophrastus, who documented everything they told him regarding the extraction methods. The sailors explained that during their coastal voyage, they landed to find water in the mountains and witnessed the trees and the gum-collecting process. They reported that incisions were made in both the branches and the stems. In some instances, the gum dripped down onto mats woven from palm leaves placed underneath, while in other cases, the resin stuck to the tree and had to be scraped off using iron tools. The cultivation of these trees was shrouded in secrecy, which naturally gave rise to bizarre myths. Writing in the 5th century BC, the historian Herodotus documented the harvesting process along with a legend about a supposed race of monsters that guarded the crop. He noted that Arabia was the southernmost inhabited land and the only place on earth where myrrh and frankincense grew. According to his account, harvesting was difficult because the trees were guarded by small, multicolored winged serpents that swarmed in great numbers around each tree. He claimed these creatures could only be driven away by the smoke of burning storax. We will likely never know if this was merely a local legend or a calculated piece of disinformation, spread by Arab frankincense farmers to scare competitors away from their profitable industry. If it was a lie, it seems to have been effective. The tales of venomous flying snakes were repeated by numerous other ancient Greek writers, and very few sea explorers were brave enough to venture inland to inspect the incense plantations personally. It is easy to understand why these commodities were in such high demand. The towns and cities of the Bronze and Iron Ages were likely filled with a potent mix of terrible smells. Even in the most sophisticated cities, sanitation was primitive if it existed at all, and a lack of centralized planning meant that waste often accumulated right next to where people lived and worked. Without refrigeration, food rotted quickly, and industries like leather tanning relied on urine and dung to process their goods. All of this combined to create an overwhelming assault on the noses of the inhabitants. For the wealthy, paying to alleviate this discomfort was well worth the cost. Beyond this practical application, burning incense also took on a massive spiritual significance. Places of worship and temples needed to establish a clear boundary between the sacred, clean interior of the temple and the dirty, smelly world outside, and incense was one of the most effective ways to achieve this. Since ancient times, humans have recognized a connection between foul odors, illness, and death. Our sense of smell partly evolved to warn us about harmful bacteria in decaying matter and waste, so people naturally observed that those living near foul-smelling areas like waste heaps and sewers fell sick and died more frequently. From the earliest recorded texts, it is evident that people viewed the presence of bad smells as proof of evil spirits, invisible entities lingering in the air, waiting to inflict misery and disease on those nearby. A major responsibility of the temple was to offer people comfort from the daily horrors of misfortune and disease, and to achieve this, they needed to construct a space free from these putrid smells and the evil associated with it. As we begin to unravel these lost timelines, leave a comment with the name of the ancient civilization that fascinates you the most. Let's see which era calls to us tonight. Anything carrying those associations was strictly barred from entering. Utilizing incense to establish a sacred atmosphere is a practice that goes back to antiquity. We see references to this in Homer's Odyssey as a component of ritual. Furthermore, the Book of Exodus details a precise mixture of spices and frankincense destined to be ground up and burned at the holy altar in front of the Ark of the Covenant, and the text strictly prohibits using this blend for anything else. The Lord instructed Moses to take specific amounts of gum resin, pure frankincense, galbanum, and onycha to create a perfumed incense blend. This mixture was to be salted, pure, and holy. He was told to grind a portion into powder and position it before the Ark of the Covenant's law inside the tent of meeting, designating it as most holy. The instruction warned against making this formula for personal use. Anyone creating this incense to enjoy the fragrance would be exiled from their community. Because of this link to the divine, incense quickly became vital to the operations of monarchy. For instance, myrrh played a role in the embalming of Egyptian pharaohs and the anointing ceremonies for Hebrew queens. Moving to the Christian New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew tells the story of wise men journeying from the east for Jesus' birth. They brought standard royal gifts, gold, myrrh, and frankincense, intended to solidify his claim as the descendant of King David and the King of the Jews. Put simply, the incense trade during this era was a major enterprise. These scents weren't merely frivolous indulgences. They served as fundamental instruments in the way state power and religious authority were established. As societies grew more centralized and their institutions gained wealth and influence, the hunger for incense only skyrocketed. By the time the 2nd and 1st centuries BC rolled around, the Nabataeans were positioned right at the core of this pivotal market. Before long, camels were lumbering along Nabataean trails, carrying crates of myrrh and frankincense from Oman, sacks of Indian spices, Syrian cloth bolts, and even African ivory and sugar. Every bit of this cargo traveled through a specific city, sitting at the intersection of numerous trade paths, a location that would eventually gain a legendary status throughout the known world. The Nabataeans called this city Rackham, but the outside world would eventually know it by the Greek term for rock, Petra. Humans have lived at the Petra site for at least 7,000 years, a fact largely attributable to the area's unique geology. A freshwater source known as Musa's spring bubbles up here, and tradition holds that this is where the biblical Moses hit a rock with his staff, causing water to burst forth from the dry stones. To early settlers, finding a spring in such an arid landscape must have looked like a miracle. As rain soaks into the porous sandstone, it collects in underground pockets before slowly seeping out along the path of least resistance. Consequently, the cliffs surrounding Petra function like massive water towers, gradually dispensing their stored water throughout the long, parched Arabian summer. Over millions of years, these trickling waters, combined with intense but short-lived winter storms, sliced through the sandstone bluffs to create a narrow, winding canyon through the solid rock known as the Sick. Past this ravine lay a perfectly sheltered area, protected from desert sands and winds by towering cliffs, complete with a steady supply of fresh water. Pliny the Elder, a Roman naturalist and author from the 1st century, provided an early description of the settlement in his book, Natural History. He wrote that the Nabataeans lived in a city called Petra, situated in a deep valley slightly less than 2 miles wide. He described it as being ringed by insurmountable mountains with a river running through it. Pliny noted that 2 primary roads converged at Petra, placing it 635 miles from the Persian Gulf and 600 miles from Gaza on the Mediterranean coast. While the natural spring water could sustain a modest community, the demand on the supply must have intensified as trade caravans expanded, and the city grew in importance. To augment the region's natural hydrology, the Nabataeans initiated complex water management projects. They carved aqueducts directly into the mountain stone and constructed underground plumbing using terracotta pipes to channel water from various nearby springs right into the settlement's center. They also mastered techniques for harvesting rainfall, which they utilized with great success. Even though the regional climate 2,000 years ago wasn't quite as dry as it is now, it was still a desert environment. Rain was incredibly scarce, with the rainy season around January often bringing only 1 or 2 downpours a year. By the peak of summer, rain ceased completely. Therefore, the Nabataeans put immense effort into capturing every drop possible during those rare storms. Rainwater would naturally pool in hollows and depressions, features that herdsmen had utilized for centuries. However, because sandstone is porous, that water would eventually seep away. To solve this, the Nabataeans began lining these natural basins with hard stucco plaster, ensuring the water stayed put and could be used well into the drought season. They erected dams spanning the valleys to capture rainwater in reservoirs and to mitigate the annual flooding caused by runoff rushing through channels carved into the red rock over millions of years. This expert management of limited water supplies allowed Petra to expand significantly, eventually sustaining a permanent population of up to 20,000 residents. It also supported the constant influx of massive trade caravans, often comprising hundreds of people and camels arriving exhausted from the arid desert routes. Before long, water became plentiful enough to serve luxury needs, not just survival. Petra's citizens could enjoy bathing, producing wine, cultivating fruit, and strolling through streets shaded by palm trees. Archaeology confirms that Petra was far more than just a city of tombs. In its prime, it bustled with lush gardens, pleasant fountains, grand temples, and opulent villas. The Roman writer Strabo offers a glimpse of this era, describing Petra as the Nabataean metropolis situated on a site that is generally level and smooth, yet naturally fortified by rock on all sides. He notes that while the outer cliffs are precipitous and sheer, the interior holds abundant springs used for both domestic purposes and watering gardens. Beyond this rocky circuit, he adds, the territory is mostly desert, particularly in the direction of Judea. Some of the Nabataeans' own writings also verify the presence of greenery within the city. One specific inscription from a tomb in Petra details the vibrant plant life that once flourished there, possibly attached to a temple, and its description offers a sharp contrast to the barren sand and stones that surround the site today. The text lists the tomb along with the large burial chamber inside and the smaller one beyond it, the courtyard in front, the porticos and inner rooms, the gardens and pleasure parks, the water walls, the cisterns, and all other property which is consecrated to Dashara, the god of our Lord, his holy seat, and the entire assembly of gods. Beyond the city limits, managing water was even more vital. To feed their population, the Nabataeans developed a specialized farming technique suited to the rugged landscape. They sculpted large sections of terrain into shallow funnels, directing all rainfall to a single lowest point where they planted a solitary fruit tree. This allowed the tree to thrive on the concentrated runoff. Although this orchard design required 50 times the land usually needed, the Nabataeans had an endless supply of open desert. This mastery of hydrology also provided a massive strategic edge. The historian Diodorus of Sicily describes how they constructed a network of hidden cisterns throughout the wasteland. This allowed the Nabataeans to travel where others could not, securing their monopoly on trade routes. During conflicts, the waterless desert served as an impenetrable fortress for them alone. Diodorus notes that they dug underground reservoirs lined with stucco, leaving only a tiny opening at the top. Once filled with rain, these openings were sealed and camouflaged with secret markers known only to their people. They even conditioned their cattle to drink only every other day, enabling the animals to survive long journeys through arid territory. Despite the challenges of sustaining a city in such a location, the rewards were immense. Petra served as the nexus of a vast spiderweb of trade routes extending to every horizon. To the east, desert tracks reached the Persian Gulf ports of Basra and Dharan, importing East Asian spices like pepper, nutmeg, ginger, and cinnamon, alongside Chinese silk and Indian gemstones. From the south, a steady stream of frankincense and myrrh arrived from the incense groves of Oman and Yemen. Petra linked the Red Sea port of Aqaba with Gaza on the Mediterranean, effectively connecting East African markets to Europe, while northern routes led to the major cities of Antioch and Damascus. Roads heading west into Egypt carried tin transported from Afghanistan, as well as blue lapis lazuli. Obsidian, a black volcanic glass, was imported from Abyssinia. Traveling north toward Greece were perfumes, scented oils, and cosmetics packed in containers made from giant Red Sea clamshells. Bitumen harvested from the Dead Sea was shipped south to Egypt, where it was essential for waterproofing boats and embalming mummies. The Nabataeans were so integral to moving these goods by land and see that they levied a 25% tax on all cargo. Consequently, the tribe became absurdly wealthy, but this fortune soon attracted envious glares. The Nabataeans were merchants rather than soldiers and generally avoided conflict, but they could defend themselves fiercely when necessary. Their rise took place in the chaotic aftermath of a massive geopolitical shift. In the late 4th century BC, the young King Alexander of Macedon swept out of northern Greece, toppling the Persian Empire and conquering territory as far as India. However, Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BC, and his vast empire instantly crumbled. His death left a power vacuum filled by rival Greek kingdoms stretching from Pakistan to Egypt, all battling for control. One of these factions was led by Antigonus, a former general and governor under Alexander. Antigonus had lost an eye to shrapnel from a shattering catapult bolt, earning him the historical moniker Antigonus Monophthalmus, or Antigonus the One-Eyed. He was singularly obsessed with reuniting Alexander's empire under his own command. He quickly annexed Syria and the Mediterranean coast, pushing his borders right up to the wealthy lands of the Nabataeans. Warfare is costly, and like many conquerors, Antigonus was constantly short on funds. He began to look greedily toward the south, dreaming of capturing Petra's fabled riches. In 312 BC, he dispatched his general, Athenius, to raid the desert and seize the trader's wealth. His troops were battle-hardened veterans of the Macedonian phalanxes, some having served Alexander himself, and they did not expect much resistance. Athenius marched from Judea with a force of 4,000 pikemen and 600 cavalry. Diodorus of Sicily records that the general was ordered to launch a surprise attack on the barbarians and plunder their livestock. The Greek army traversed 160 kilometers of desert in just 3 days, finally sighting the legendary stone metropolis. Athenius organized a night assault, waiting as the sun set in a purple haze over the rosy sandstone. Under the cover of darkness, they stormed the city, finding it virtually unguarded as the Nabataean men were away on a trade expedition. A frenzy of looting ensued, revealing the staggering wealth hidden within Petra. The soldiers loaded their pack animals with as much frankincense and myrrh as they could carry and stole nearly 14 tons of silver. In a final act of cruelty, they abducted the women and children to sell as slaves. Diodorus recounts that they killed some residents, captured others, left the wounded, and escaped with the bulk of the spices and about 500 talents of silver. The Greeks, hardly believing their luck at such an effortless victory, they gathered their loot and slaves and retreated down the road to safety as quickly as possible. Burdened by heavy treasure and prisoners, and with their horses struggling against the harsh desert terrain, they managed to put about 36 kilometers between themselves and Petra before deciding it was safe enough to set up camp. However, they had failed to account for the Nabataean army's camel-powered agility. Just a few hours after Athenius and his troops departed, the first local men arrived back at the city. Upon discovering their temples and homes ransacked and their families taken, they listened to the accounts of injured survivors and instantly organized a pursuit. Riders were dispatched to recruit more fighters from every village they passed, causing the Nabataean force to grow into a massive horde of 8,000 camel-mounted warriors. Moving with incredible velocity across the sands, they easily outran the Greek horses and reached Athenius' location by nightfall. Athenius' men were completely exhausted and, thinking they were safe, had fallen into a deep sleep. A handful of captives managed to sneak away and inform the pursuers about the enemy's condition, prompting the 8,000-strong force to launch their assault around the third watch. Hidden by the night, the furious Nabataeans flooded the Greek encampment and decimated everyone they could find. Many of the hostile troops were executed right where they slept, while the rest were struck down by javelins as they woke up and scrambled for their weapons. By the end, the entire infantry force was destroyed, and only around 50 cavalrymen managed to escape, most of whom were suffering from wounds. Having delivered this severe punishment to the enemy, the Nabataeans took their recovered property and returned to the rock. With every single Greek foot soldier dead and merely 50 horsemen surviving to flee back across the desert, the raid ended in total failure. This was a staggering humiliation for the Greeks, but it is obvious that the Nabataeans actually had no interest in fighting a war. To clarify their stance, they dispatched a message to King Antigonus written in Aramaic, which was the common tongue of the ancient Middle East. This letter explained exactly why they had wiped out his forces and asked for an end to any further aggression. The humiliated Greek king was obviously trying his hardest to save his reputation. In their note to Antigonus, penned in Syrian characters, they accused Athenius of being the problem and justified their own behavior. Antigonus replied, agreeing that their self-defense was warranted, but he found fault with Athenius, claiming the attack went against the orders he had been given. He did this to hide his true plans and to trick the barbarians into feeling secure. The Arabs were delighted to apparently be free of such great fears, yet they didn't fully trust what Antigonus said. Viewing their future as uncertain, they positioned watchmen on the hills where it was easy to spot the passes into Arabia from a long distance. This final precaution turned out to be completely justified. As a matter of fact, King Antigonus had no intention of keeping the peace or accepting a defeat by people he viewed as barbarians. He ordered his son Demetrius to march back into Nabataean territory and finish what Athenius failed to do, this time with another 4,000 foot soldiers and a much larger group of 4,000 cavalry. But Demetrius would not find much more success. The sentries the Nabataeans had placed along their borders quickly saw the approaching Greeks and lit warning fires on the hilltops. The desert dwellers scattered their herds, tucking them away in narrow crevices and concealed spots, and took all their precious items, women, and children with them. They all fled to a stone fortress, likely the flat-topped mountain known as al-Biyara, which is the highest point near the city of Petra. Upon arriving at the rock and discovering the flocks were gone, Demetrius launched repeated attacks on the stronghold. The people inside resisted firmly and easily held the advantage due to the height of the location. So, on that day, after continuing the fight until evening, he called his soldiers back with a trumpet blast. The Greek general Demetrius was clearly frustrated. The single narrow path up to the mountain fortress made a direct assault virtually impossible, and it is evident that at least one of the Nabataeans was gifted with words. As Demetrius came forward the next day for a new round of attacks, someone shouted down from the walls with an impassioned plea that Diodorus of Sicily records. On the following day, when he advanced on the rock, one of the barbarians called out to him, asking King Demetrius what desire or compulsion drove him to war against those who live in the desert, in a land with no water, grain, wine, or any other necessities of life. He explained that since they were unwilling to be slaves, they had all taken refuge in a country lacking everything valued by other peoples, choosing a life in the desert that harmed no one. He then begged both him and his father to do them no injury, but instead to accept our gifts, withdraw your army, and consider the Nabataeans your friends from this day forward. After all, you cannot remain here much longer since you lack water and other essential supplies, nor can you force us to adopt a different way of life. Knowledge grows when it is shared. If you know a fellow seeker, or just someone who needs a peaceful escape into the past, feel free to share this video with them. This moment highlights the two major advantages the Nabataeans possessed. First, their strategic command over water, concealed in secret reservoirs, made any long-term siege of their city impossible, while their immense wealth meant they could often simply pay their enemies to leave. Demetrius likely realized that maintaining the siege was a hopeless endeavor. He agreed to accept the payment from the Nabataeans and marched back home, perhaps not victorious, but definitely a good deal wealthier. His father, King Antigonus, appears to have been furious at his son's choice, as recorded by Diodorus. When Demetrius returned and gave a full report of his actions, Antigonus scolded him for establishing a treaty with the Nabataeans. He argued that Demetrius had only emboldened the barbarians by letting them go unpunished, as they would assume they were spared because of his inability to defeat them, rather than his kindness. This episode provides a wonderful glimpse into the unique survival tactics the Nabataeans used. It shows that they built their empire not on conquest and death, but on the scarce drops of fresh water from desert rocks and the continuous movement of silver coins passing from hand to hand across the sands. In recounting the Nabataean story, however, there is one voice that is clearly missing, the voice of the Nabataeans themselves. From what we can determine, the Nabataeans possessed a high degree of literacy, and it seems even the average person could read and write. The script they used was a form of late Aramaic, which evolved from the imperial Aramaic utilized by the Persian Empire. We have found evidence of graffiti etched onto stones all across the Jordanian desert, seemingly left by shepherds who were capable of writing at least their own names along with short inscriptions. But despite this apparently common literacy, No actual histories or accounts written by the Nabataeans have survived to this day. We might never discover the reason for this silence. It is possible that the tribal origins of Nabataean society meant they inherited a class of oral historians and storytellers whose specific role was to memorize and perform their past. And as long as these living archives existed, writing things down likely felt redundant. It is even conceivable that these oral historians protected their own status and relevance by strictly forbidding their knowledge from being recorded in text. However, that is merely speculation, because the Nabataeans themselves have left us nothing but silence regarding this issue. Because we lack their own internal documents, telling their story requires us to scour the records of foreign civilizations for any mentions of them. These references are usually short and broken, acting like sudden camera flashes that briefly illuminate the Nabataeans before they vanish back into the shadows of history. Roughly half a century after the incident with Antigonus the One-Eyed and his 2 failed conquest attempts, a vivid story emerges from the files of Zenon, an Egyptian politician who served as the right-hand man to the Ptolemaic finance minister around 259 BC. One specific papyrus details a report from a chariot driver who watched his co-workers get into a tense situation with a group of Nabataeans. These Greek drivers were apparently running a side business as human traffickers, transporting and selling enslaved women in the cities they passed through. The memo to Zenon from Heraclides the charioteer describes how 2 men, Drimilus and Dionysius, mistreated a slave girl before handing her off to a border guard. Upon returning from that transaction, they ran into the Nabataeans, and following a loud objection, the men were arrested and kept in chains for a week. Heraclides concludes by stating that he can reveal the full truth if questioned further. This mysterious and fascinating entry leaves many questions unanswered, but it proves that the Nabataeans were already well-known figures throughout the Middle East. It remains unclear exactly why the Nabataeans shouted in protest or why they decided to imprison these men. While it could have been a simple trade dispute or a personal slight, some historians suspect that the Nabataeans were disgusted by the mistreatment of the captive women and chose to enforce their own brand of justice. Nabataean culture seems to have treated women with great respect. We see proof of this on specific coins where queens are depicted right beside kings, as well as on tomb inscriptions that identify women as the heads of their households. Consequently, it is quite reasonable to assume that the Greek behavior toward these women would have been deeply offensive to Nabataean cultural values. We get another intriguing snapshot from the writings of the Roman Jewish historian Flavius Josephus regarding the Jewish Maccabean rebellion against the Seleucid Empire roughly a century later. A Jewish priest named Judas Maccabeus led this uprising, and at one stage, he and his brother Jonathan were forced to retreat across the Jordan River to escape Seleucid troops. It was here that Josephus describes an encounter where the brothers and their rebel army ran into a party of Nabataeans. These locals approached them with friendship and actually warned them about the brutal acts the Seleucids were inflicting on a nearby Jewish community. Josephus details that after Judas and Jonathan crossed the Jordan and traveled for 3 days, they found the Nabataeans who greeted them peacefully. They reported on the dire situation in the land of Gilead, explaining that many were in distress and trapped in garrisons or Galilee cities. They urged Judas to hurry, attack the foreigners, and save his countrymen from their grip. Judas listened to this advice, went back to the wilderness, and immediately attacked and captured the city of Basra. Once again, this brief glimpse is captivating yet frustratingly incomplete. It appears the Nabataeans maintained a long-term friendship with the Judeans and were clearly supportive of their uprising. Since the Nabataeans placed such a high value on their own autonomy, they likely viewed the Judean fight for liberty with a sense of shared struggle and sympathy. However, there was certainly a strategic upside as well, since the conflict offered a perfect chance to antagonize their strong northern adversaries, the Seleucid Empire. We find the very first specific reference to a Nabataean monarch in an inscription discovered at the Haluza archaeological site, located deep within the Negev desert. Carved in a primitive version of the Nabataean script, the text simply reads, "This is the place which Nutaru made for the life of King Aretas, king of the Nabataeans." This King Aretas is the earliest ruler we can positively identify, proving that by this era, the society had evolved from a loose alliance of tribes into a formal kingdom. Jumping forward about 50 years to 129 BC, historical records provide another snapshot establishing that Petra was now acknowledged as a major capital in the region. This evidence comes from a text left by Moskion, son of Kaidimos, a Greek diplomat from the city of Priene in modern-day Turkey. The record details Moskion's official travels throughout the area, notably listing Petra in the same context as the famous metropolis of Alexandria in Egypt. The inscription explains that he frequently acted as an envoy to various cities and kings, always working for the public good. While his earlier diplomatic work was voluntary, the text notes that when his homeland sent him on official business to King Ptolemy in Alexandria and to Petra in Arabia, his stay lasted much longer than anyone anticipated. It is evident that the Nabataean people had matured into a genuine regional power by this time, earning the respect of their neighbors. They directly ruled territory spanning the Arabian Peninsula, the Negev Desert, and Palestine, yet their influence reached even further. Their merchandise-filled caravans appeared in countless cities, and they even crossed oceans to trade with distant nations. And as the power of the Nabataeans increased, the grandeur of their rock-cut capital rose to match it. Petra became a bustling center of building projects, where locals carved out tombs and temples that mirrored the designs used by their strong neighbors, the Greeks. It was during this era, specifically the 1st century BC, that Petra's inhabitants created the absolute masterpiece of their distinct rock-carving tradition. This massive structure is what we now call the Great Treasury, or the Khazneh. Standing tall, the Khazneh ranks among the most renowned landmarks on the globe today. Scholars believe it served as a royal tomb for a Nabataean ruler, with candidates including Aretas II, Abodas III, or the man who followed him, Aretas IV. However, there are no writings next to this gigantic sculpture to clarify its function or identify its creator. Currently, the treasury acts as a quiet witness to the Nabataean kingdom's peak, and it appears the entire design was intended to stun anyone who laid eyes on it. Travelers in antiquity would trek down the Sick, a tight gorge winding between high sandstone cliffs, before suddenly breaking out into this dramatic visual display. The facade's high galleries and columns still deliver that same punch to visitors today, over 2,000 years since the architects were alive. When construction finished, the floor outside the Khazneh sat roughly 4 meters lower than the current level, with a sharp set of stairs connecting to the columned entrance. This structure's style blends local rock-carving techniques with Greek architecture, featuring carvings of Nabataean deities next to Egyptian figures like Isis and Greek gods such as Tyche, the protector of cities and fortune. Through this mixed design, Petra's residents were clearly asserting that they were on par with the neighboring Greek empires, establishing their home as a major global metropolis. Laborers used iron chisels and pickaxes to carve the monument, and you can still spot traces of the scaffolding used by these workers, who faced hazardous conditions and long hours to achieve such flawless symmetry. Upon its completion, the treasury must have astonished the locals, as no structure like it had ever existed in their town before. Over the next 100 years, however, this edifice served as a template for other construction projects. Examples of this influence include the Corinthian tomb and the stone frontage called the monastery. Yet, compared to the Khazneh's soaring face, these later attempts are not as large, daring, or aesthetically balanced. Because travelers visited the area in later years, we have gathered plenty of information regarding the daily experiences of a typical Petra resident. Strabo, a geographer and writer from 1st century Greece, described the Nabataean diet. He noted that while the land lacks olives, forcing them to rely on sesame oil, it is otherwise rich in fruit. Their oxen are big and their sheep have white wool, but since the region doesn't breed horses, they use camels for all necessary tasks. A 10th century cookbook, written by Ibn Sayyar al-Warraq, also mentions a specific fermented item called Khubz al-Ma al-Nabati, which translates to Nabataean water bread. The recipe says to get a large wooden bowl and sift 7.5 pounds of high-grade Sami flour into it. Then, combine that with 3 ounces of yeast, followed by 3 ounces of salt that you have dissolved in water and filtered. Work the dough into a consistency that is rock-hard and compact it thoroughly. Cover the mixture and allow it to ferment. Using oil from hulled sesame seeds, separate the dough into portions, light the tanner oven, and wait for the fire to settle into a gentle smolder. Rub 2 dirhams worth of olive or sesame oil onto each piece, flatten them by hand, and stick them to the inside walls of the hot oven. Most likely, the Nabataeans handled these baking chores at the break of dawn to avoid lighting fires during the unbearable midday heat. Picture the smoke from these ovens floating through the city's shadowed canyons during those chilly desert mornings, while the aroma of yeast, fresh bread, and frying sesame oil saturated the atmosphere. Historical records suggest that strolling through Petra was a vibrant sensory experience. The ancient historian Strabo describes the locals wearing multicolored garments and the various scents filling the alleyways. Instead of tunics, they wore loincloths and slippers on their feet, a style adopted even by royalty, although the kings distinguished themselves by wearing purple. While some goods were entirely foreign imports, others were produced locally. Native resources included silver, gold, and the majority of aromatic spices, while items like iron, brass, purple clothing, styrax, costaria, crocus, paintings, and molded or embossed crafts had to be brought in from outside lands. Spiritual life in Nabataea centered on Dashara, a paternal deity similar to Zeus in Greek mythology, who oversaw justice and held a connection to the sun. Worshippers typically depicted him using basic square stone blocks. Devotees presented animal sacrifices to Dashara, along with tributes consisting of Petra's most plentiful trade good, incense. To honor the sun, they constructed altars on their rooftops to pour daily libations and burn frankincense. It is certain that Petra's temples released massive plumes of myrrh, frankincense, and other scents into the streets, blending with the odors of goats, camels, charcoal fires, and roasting meals. A large portion of the population remained nomadic, moving perpetually between trading posts throughout the year. To preserve their social bonds, they apparently united annually for a massive event, equal parts feast, ceremony, and marketplace, where scattered tribes met to swap merchandise, share tales, chat, and naturally consume wine. Strabo documented the scenes at these gatherings, noting a surprising absence of slaves, a detail that would have astonished anyone accustomed to the Roman Empire. As the date for this national assembly approached, locals would travel to the meeting point, leaving their valuables, elderly, women, and children on a specific rock. Because slavery was rare, they relied on relatives or each other for service, or simply served themselves, a practice that even the kings followed. Communal dining took place in parties of 13, with 2 female vocalists entertaining at every banquet. The king hosted lavish drinking sessions, though consumption was limited to 11 cups per person, with a fresh gold goblet used for each round. Demonstrating a democratic spirit, the monarch not only served his own needs, but occasionally took turns serving his guests. Scholars often find it aggravating that we must depend on outside descriptions to reconstruct daily Nabataean life. However, this civilization did bequeath us one significant literary collection: the inscriptions etched into their monumental tombs using their unique alphabet. A large number of the best-preserved examples are located at Hegra, situated in what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia. Established by King Aretas IV during the late 1st century BC, Hegra served as the realm's second capital. In certain respects, the rock-cut tombs here are even more striking than Petra's, as they dominate the horizon of the flat desert and are visible from far away. The most renowned structure is called Qasr al-Farid in Arabic, meaning the lonely castle. Its craftsmanship rivals anything in Petra, standing as a ghostly memorial to the buried city that used to exist there. The writings on the Hegra tombs are extraordinary. Although over 2 millennia of desert wind has worn many down, others remain perfectly readable. These texts often threaten thieves with divine curses, yet they also functioned as binding legal contracts, guaranteeing that the tomb remained in the possession of one specific family for generations, with financial penalties for any violations. A particularly clear example of this hybrid legal religious text comes from a tomb in Hegra. It reads, "This platform, enclosure, and tomb were created by Hoshabu, son of Naphiu and grandson of Alkuf the Temanite. He built it for himself, his children, his mother Habu, and his sisters Rufu and Aftiu, along with their children. It is declared forever inviolable by the customs of the Salamians and Nabataeans. May Dashara curse anyone who buries a stranger here, or who sells, buys, leases, pledges, gifts, or disposes of this place. Anyone who acts against what is written here is liable to the god Dashara for the sum of 1,000 selas, and owes the same amount to our lord King Haratat. Written in the month of Shebat, in the 13th year of Haratate, king of the Nabataeans, lover of his people." Inside the structure, a shorter text marks the niches. It states, "These are the 2 burial niches of Hoshabu, son of Naphiu, and his children Abdalga and Habu. May the one who separates night from day curse anyone who removes them for all eternity." Most tomb inscriptions adhere to this general template, and while the information they offer is restricted, they become incredibly meaningful, and even quite sad, when we realize they are the only actual texts written by the Nabataeans that we have left. Their entire civilization's written legacy now exists solely on their grave markers. We can gather small fragments of knowledge from these short carvings. We discover the names of their deities and understand a bit about their religious perspective. We hear their actual names and can sometimes reconstruct their family lineages, identifying sisters, wives, and children. There are clues pointing to a society where authority was split between the king and the temple, and where a sophisticated legal framework used fines to enforce the law. Some carvings even credit the stonemasons who built the tomb, hinting at the high-status artists enjoyed in this city built of rock. One example reads, "In the month of Nisan, during the 36th year of Haratate, king of the Nabataeans, lover of his people, this tomb was made by the masons Afta, son of Abdobadet, Wabu, son of Afsa, and Huru." Because these inscriptions frequently list the deceased's job, we also get a fascinating snapshot of the diverse careers available in Petra and Hegra. We see people like Malchian, who was an omen diviner, and Sulle, a governor. There was Idu the prefect, Manitou the exorcist priest, Colin the doctor, and Sadalahi the centurion. Every one of them lived a complete life, walking the streets, shopping in markets, and dwelling in the homes of these great cities. They had secrets, dreams, lovers, families, and friends, but today nothing remains except these weathering carvings, gradually fading away due to rain and desert wind. However, despite controlling regional trade for hundreds of years, the Nabataeans were about to meet an adversary that they could not defeat in battle or pay off with gold. A massive imperial force was rising on a peninsula in the distant central Mediterranean, soon to expand to its maximum height, swallowing the entire Mediterranean Sea and the Arabian territories beyond. That force was the power of Rome. As the 1st century BC came to a close, the Roman Republic had evolved into the Roman Empire, a confident and aggressive military machine. By this point in time, Judea had already been seized by Rome, which installed the tyrannical puppet ruler Herod the Great to manage the territory as a colony. By 30 BC, the Roman legions had also taken over the Greek kingdom of Ptolemaic Egypt, marching all the way to the banks of the Nile. Just like the empires that came before them, the Romans soon turned their greedy gaze eastward, eyeing the wealthy Nabataean lands and the aromatic fields of Arabia. The Roman appetite for incense was absolutely massive. Their religious rituals required burning myrrh and frankincense in temples that, thanks to rapid imperial expansion, now spanned from Mesopotamia to Morocco and from Scotland down to Tunisia. Estimates suggest that at the trade's peak, the empire imported more than 1 million kilograms of frankincense annually. Since the Nabataeans slapped a hefty 25% tax on these goods, it isn't surprising that Rome started looking for a way to eliminate the middleman and seize control of the incense market for themselves. In the year 26 BC, Emperor Augustus decided to act. He dispatched Aelius Gallus, a prefect stationed in Roman Egypt, along with a modest military force. Their mission was to venture into southern Arabia and set up direct commercial lines with the locals there. The historian Strabo recorded exactly what the goal of this journey was. He noted that Gallus intended to either befriend the Arabians or conquer them. This decision was driven by long-standing rumors of their immense riches. Reports claimed they traded precious stones and aromatics for silver and gold, but never spent that wealth with outsiders. Essentially, Gallus planned to either conduct business with rich allies or dominate rich adversaries. Strangely enough, the Nabataeans appeared incredibly enthusiastic about assisting the Roman mission. They even volunteered one of their own men to serve as a guide. Gallus felt encouraged by this support, as the locals seemed friendly and pledged their full cooperation. Given that a successful Roman expedition would financially ruin the Nabataeans, you would think the Romans might have doubted this generosity, but they apparently accepted it without question. The guide dispatched by the Nabataean monarch was Silius, a high-ranking and crafty political figure. He had a very difficult job to do. He needed to look like he was helping the Romans to avoid provoking the powerful empire, yet his king had explicitly ordered that the mission must fail. Caught between his own ruler and the Roman forces, Silius likely suffered plenty of anxiety while leading the army across the Arabian sands. Strabo explains how the situation played out. He writes that Gallus began the campaign but was duped by Silius. Even though the Nabataean administrator had sworn to lead the way, provide supplies, and work together, he betrayed them at every turn. As the timeline stretches back thousands of years, it is easy to feel small against the vastness of history. If you are enjoying this journey through time so far, comment the word ancient, so I know you're still with me. He refused to show them a secure path along the coast or a safe route overland, instead steering the commander through roadless wilderness and circuitous detours. He led them into barren regions completely devoid of supplies and along rocky coastlines that lacked harbors, forcing them through dangerous shallows and waters filled with hidden reefs. In these areas, the violent shifting of the tides caused the Romans immense distress. It is obvious now that Silius was actively working to sabotage the expedition at every step, employing every trick he knew to weaken Gallus' forces. After 2 brutal weeks of these hardships, the fleet finally reached Leucombe in Nabataean territory, though by then Gallus had lost many ships and their crews to the treacherous sailing conditions rather than enemy fire. This disaster was entirely due to Silius' deception. He had insisted there was no land route for an army to reach Leucombe, even though local camel traders regularly made the journey from Petra with total safety and ease. The weary expedition would spend the next 6 months dragging itself up the coast of southern Arabia, decimated by shipwrecks and disease, and suffering from the effects of bad water and poisoned herbs. The guide led them in circles through stony wastelands and took the longest, roughest paths available, leaving the soldiers to bake in the searing heat where they succumbed to fatigue and sunstroke. Eventually, with his army reduced to a fraction of its original size, Gallus had to accept failure. Even though he was heartbreakingly close to his destination, he worried that continuing would kill everyone, and he feared the return trip would consume another 6 months. He ordered a retreat back along the desert roads, and it was only during this return march that he realized he had been played. Captives revealed that he had turned back only 2 days' march from the aromatic-producing lands, yet he had wasted half a year getting there due to sabotage. Once he understood the plot and switched to different roads, the return trip took only 60 days, compared to the 6 months wasted on the initial journey. We don't know if Silius stayed to face the Roman commander's wrath or if he vanished into the night, but Strabo describes the pathetic return of the expedition to its base in Alexandria. They arrived empty-handed, transporting the army across the Myos harbor in 11 days to bring the lucky survivors home. The vast majority of the losses were due to hunger, sickness, exhaustion, and terrible travel conditions, as only 7 soldiers actually died in combat. Consequently, the disastrous campaign added almost nothing to Rome's knowledge of the region. Silius likely returned to Petra to a hero's welcome, having successfully defended his people. The catastrophe set Roman ambitions back significantly, and as the empire became distracted by civil wars, they stopped thinking about Arabian expansion. Silius' treachery bought the Nabataeans over a century of independence, but the internal conflicts in Rome wouldn't last forever. As the calendar turned from the first millennium BC to the first millennium AD, the writing was on the wall. Rome consolidated its massive empire, officially absorbing Syria, Mesopotamia, and Judea. The kingdom of Nabataea found itself encircled by this superpower, and its days as a sovereign state were numbered. The final Nabataean king, Rabel II, passed away in 106 AD after a 36-year reign. Immediately upon his death, Emperor Trajan ordered 2 legions to invade and annex the territory. There was no real justification for this aggression. Rabel had a legitimate heir named Obodas ready to succeed him, but Rome simply didn't want to miss the opportunity. The campaign was led by Cornelius Palma, the governor of Syria. Under Palma's orders, the 3rd Cyrenaica Legion marched north from Egypt to seize Petra, while the 6th Ferrata Legion, a garrison unit from Syria, moved south to occupy Bostra. From what history tells us, the Romans met almost no resistance. The takeover was so uneventful that the historian Cassius Dio, who typically wrote with great color and detail, had almost nothing to say about it, simply noting that Palma was the governor at the time. The governor of Syria, Cornelius Palma, was the man responsible for subduing the Arabian territory surrounding Petra and bringing it under the authority of Rome. This annexation is mentioned only briefly in historical records, sandwiched between vivid descriptions of Emperor Trajan's wars in Dacia and his massive celebratory games featuring 10,000 gladiators. Even the currency produced to commemorate the event suggests that this was a low-key affair. The coins bore the inscription Arabia adquisita, meaning acquired, rather than the standard military term capta, or captured. To the Roman mindset, this land was simply obtained rather than conquered by force. While a few units of the elite Nabataean royal guard appear to have put up a fight, the vast majority of the regular army saw the futility of resisting the inevitable. As Roman legions marched into the city, the era of Nabataean independence officially closed. Rome established a new province named Arabia Petrea, honoring the great city, and the chapter of Roman Petra began. Historical evidence suggests that for the average resident of the kingdom, the Roman takeover initially had a negligible impact on daily existence. As historian Jane Taylor explains, the change was mostly administrative, affecting only the governors and a small circle of top officials. Eventually, the former royal army was integrated into the Roman military structure, forming 6 cohorts that totaled about 6,000 soldiers. However, the non-military population, including scribes, priests, stonemasons, landowners, ceramicists, jugglers, musicians, and minor bureaucrats, mostly remained in place. They simply paid their taxes to a new government and continued their traditional routines with very little disruption. Typically, when Rome seized a new territory, they immediately began constructing aqueducts and hydraulic infrastructure, but in Petra, they conspicuously left the existing water systems alone. This implies that the Romans found the Nabataean engineering so skillful that they saw no need for improvement. Instead, to secure their new acquisition, and perhaps driven by lingering memories of Aelius Gallus' disastrous expedition, the Romans focused on transportation. They constructed a massive highway running the length of the territory, known as the Via Nova Traiana, or Trajan's New Road. This 400-kilometer route linked Bostra and Petra directly to the Red Sea port of Aqaba. Dotted with forts to ensure permanent supervision of the trade networks and the southern incense fields, This road allowed Roman forces to mobilize quickly across the region. Aelius Aristides, a Roman citizen living in the province of Asia during the 2nd century AD, documented the prevailing attitude of the time, revealing that Romans felt the wild lands of Arabia had finally been tamed. He wrote that wars had faded into legendary stories of the past, allowing a man to travel between nations as safely as if he were in his own homeland. According to Aristides, Romans no longer feared the Cilician Pass, the sandy desert tracks leading to Egypt, the height of mountains, the width of rivers, or even hostility from barbarian tribes. Simply possessing Roman citizenship was now a guarantee of personal security. However, for the city of Petra itself, this annexation marked the beginning of a slow decline. Over the following centuries, the city would be undermined by vast economic and cultural shifts that were transforming the wider world. During the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Roman Empire experienced radical changes. The cult of Jesus Christ, which began as a fringe group venerating an executed Jewish prophet, expanded until it posed a genuine challenge to imperial authority. For a period, the empire outlawed Christianity, and records from the reign of Emperor Diocletian indicate that Christians in Petra were persecuted for refusing to offer sacrifices to Roman deities. Many were condemned to fatal forced labor in the nearby copper mines of Phaeno. Eventually, Emperor Constantine adopted Christianity, establishing it as the dominant faith of the late Roman Empire. As Christian customs spread, they fundamentally altered religious ceremonies, which in turn had a massive impact on the commodities Petra relied on. While modern observers associate incense with Catholic and Orthodox rituals, early Christians specifically rejected incense to distinguish their worship from pagan practices. As pagan temples closed down, the demand for frankincense collapsed, causing prices to plummet. This shift in consumer demand coincided with a logistical change, as Egyptian ports began to replace overland routes for transporting silk, spices, and incense. When the Nabataeans were independent, they fiercely protected their land-based incense trade, but the Roman conquerors preferred the efficiency of maritime transport to Egypt over the difficult desert roads. Consequently, the Nabataeans' worst fear became reality. Petra's status as a central trading hub began to fade. Despite naming the province Arabia Petrea, the Romans ultimately found little practical use for the Rose City. The very characteristics that made Petra ideal for the Nabataeans, its remote, hidden, and inaccessible nature, made it unsuitable for Roman administrators who required efficient connections to the capital. Governance of the province increasingly shifted north to the well-connected city of Bostra, further diminishing Petra's political prominence. By this time, Petra must have presented a melancholy sight. The workshops and markets that once bustled with noise and commerce likely shrank year by year as caravan traffic dwindled. The magnificent cliffside dwellings, where families once watched the sunset and children played, were gradually abandoned, becoming shelters for wild dogs and desert bats that screeched through the emptying valleys at night. Yet, despite its waning influence, Petra might have persisted as a significant trading post if not for the catastrophe that struck on May 18, 363 AD. In the dead of night, the ground began to shudder and shake, accompanied by a deep subterranean rumble. Deep within the Red Sea fault line, the Arabian and African tectonic plates shifted against each other, triggering a massive seismic event known today as the Galilee earthquake. This disaster involved severe tremors spanning May 18 and 19. A letter attributed to Bishop Cyril of Jerusalem describes the terrifying scale of the event. He notes that the disaster struck partly at the 3rd hour of Monday and partly at the 9th hour of the night, causing immense loss of life. Cyril describes the land shaking violently and great fires consuming many victims. He reports that Christians and Jews alike perished in great numbers, not only from the quake itself, but also from the resulting fires and heavy rains. Cyril provides a list of the devastated settlements, stating that over half of Petra was destroyed. His account records that more than half of Beit Gubrin was overthrown, along with part of Bashan, the entirety of Sebastia and Nicopolis, and parts of Tiberias. He adds the grisly detail that Haifa flowed with blood for 3 days. Another historical chronicler, Thomas from the Resena region, interpreted the earthquake as divine retribution for the region's continued paganism. He wrote that the Lord was angered by the cities of the pagans, Jews, Samaritans, and the false teachings in the south associated with the madness of the pagan Emperor Julian. Thomas described anger going out from the Lord to destroy 21 unclean cities that had been defiled by unjustly shed blood. He noted that in the month of Iyar, in the year 674, some cities were overturned and others collapsed. Archaeological findings in Petra confirm this narrative of sudden, catastrophic destruction. One excavated house from this period was found reduced to rubble, with the roof collapsed over a wealth of daily items including shattered glass, ceramics, lamps, spindles, coins, and a copper pot with an iron handle. Near the entryway, a smashed vessel containing 85 small copper coins was discovered, evidently kept for daily purchases. The fact that these coins were never retrieved or looted indicates that the destruction was so total that the shrinking population could not even salvage their belongings, let alone rebuild. The earthquake dealt a severe blow to Petra's public infrastructure. The Great Temple, the Temple of the Winged Lions, and the public theater were all damaged and never repaired. Most devastating, however, was the destruction of the hydraulic systems. Subterranean pipes cracked, leaking precious water into the sand, while aqueducts split open. Dams meant to capture rainwater failed, leading to flash floods that wasted the city's water reserves. Petra's existence depended entirely on its ability to store water. As that complex engineering failed, the city's remaining vitality drained away into the desert dust. Evidence shows that some residents did return to the ruins. Along the colonnaded street, archaeologists found that debris was cleared to build a shantytown of simple shelters using scavenged materials. However, with the dams destroyed, seasonal flash floods were no longer controlled. Layers of sand and silt found on the floors of these humble structures prove that floodwaters routinely crashed into homes, followed by months of severe drought. While some domestic life continued, and new churches were even constructed using recycled stones from ruined monuments, a second earthquake in the early 5th century effectively ended the occupation of the grand houses. The dream of Petra was over, and the city fell into ruin. In the years following, a reduced population continued to inhabit the area, maintaining Petra as a modest stop for caravans. People lived in the hollowed-out caves and farmed the terraced hills well into the modern era. During the transition from the Eastern Roman Empire to the Byzantine Empire, Petra was designated the capital of the province Palestina Tertia. A discovery of 140 papyrus scrolls in a church, containing contracts dated as late as 590 AD, proves that an active community still existed. The writer John Moschus records that Petra even had a bishop named Athenogenes in the early 7th century. However, by the year 687, the city's decline was so advanced that the position was abolished. When Arab armies swept through the region, inspired by the Prophet Mohammed and the new faith of Islam, Petra was apparently of no interest to them. The city does not appear in early Islamic records or narratives of the conquest. As power in the region reshuffled once again, Petra was finally abandoned. Interestingly, the Arabic spoken by these new rulers was a direct descendant of the Nabataean language once spoken in Petra. Yet, to the conquerors, the Rose City was irrelevant, a ghost town of tombs lost among the rocks. Later Muslim empires were struck by the monumental ruins at Petra and Hegra. To explain them, they recounted legends of a tribe called the Thamud who were punished by God for rejecting the prophet Salih. One version of this story appears in the Quran in the Surah Al-Araf. It describes how the people defied Salih, challenging him to bring about the punishment he threatened if he truly came from Allah. An earthquake subsequently seized them, leaving them prostrate in their homes. Salih turned away, lamenting that he had delivered his Lord's message and offered good advice, but the people did not love advisors. The text emphasizes that God provided the earth, mountains, and rain for sustenance, yet the people of the Stone Valley denied the messengers. They felt secure carving homes into the mountains, but a mighty blast overtook them, rendering their achievements useless. For these later generations, the towering Nabataean ruins served as a warning against arrogance, a stone reminder that the power of God or nature can always dismantle the works of man. For others, the silent ruins simply became an inspiration for poetry. As we close the book on this era, please leave a like if this story helped you relax or learn something new. Comment which historical mystery you want me to open up in the next video, and subscribe to the channel to ensure you never miss a night in the